Have you ever walked out of a meeting thinking that I explained my point, explained my reasoning, explained what matters, but none of it really landed? Here's an interesting part. The other person may also feel the same way, where they explain their reasoning and what matters, but they're walking away with their position not really being understood or taken on board. In this video, you'll understand why listening is a lot more harder than you think, and why it becomes even more harder when you're talking about things that matter, and what you can do to improve on that. I wonder how many difficult conversations failed because a lack of speaking well compared to a lack of listening. It's two different radio stations transmitting on the same frequency but not really being received. Now let's get into why listening is a lot more harder than it seems. I believe a lot of us generally want to listen to the other person when they're speaking, but the thing is, it becomes a lot more difficult when what we're talking about is something that matters to us, and the more that matters, the more difficult it becomes to pay full attention to them. When we feel our reputation is on the line, when we feel that something that we really want is on the line, it becomes that much more difficult to pay attention to the person when they're speaking. People don't always listen as well as they think they do. Outwardly, it probably looks like you're listening very well. Eye contact when appropriate, being quiet, nodding. Internally, part of your attention has already left from what the person is saying and focusing on how do I challenge what he's saying. He didn't really understand the perspective correctly. And what happens is you're not now listening to understand, you're listening to reply to what they have to say. And the thing is, you really usually don't notice you're doing it until afterwards. And then you realize it when you don't actually remember what they were saying, when it becomes your time to speak. For a long time, I thought listening simply meant being quiet when the other person's speaking. Don't interrupt them, let them finish. But the thing is, you can be completely quiet, but not understand what the person's saying to you. And the reason why? Physically you're present, but mentally you're not. And this is why listening becomes harder when what's being spoken about matters to you. So imagine you're spending weeks on a particular assignment, and then when your manager looks at it or your senior colleague looks at it, they mention some points that need to be improved on, or a form of a criticism even. And what happens then is an emotion starts to stir inside, and when the emotions get involved, you start looking inward rather than paying attention to what they're saying. And then you start thinking, how do I defend myself? And what happens is, when defensiveness comes into the picture, curiosity goes out of the window, and you become less curious, i.e. the understanding of what the other person is saying becomes less and less, and the focus becomes more on self-protection and how you can counteract what they're saying. Listening is less about trying to find the best response, but more about finding better questions to ask. And then because of that, the attention redirects to the speaker, and it helps you understand better where their position is coming from. And there's a key distinction here. Listening and understanding does not equal surrendering to what their opinion is. It's understanding. But accepting or taking that opinion on as the correct one, that's a different story. And that's dependent on the merit of what they're saying. What happens is, the more we feel unheard, the more difficult it becomes to listen. So if the goal shifts from making your point clearly to making the other person feel understood, so here are some tips that can help. The first is, instead of thinking, what should I be saying, or what's the best thing to say, think, how can I better understand what the other person is saying? And also note this, that when the person says the first reasons, for example, why they have a problem, usually if you spend a bit more time on it, it's usually something else that's actually the reason for the frustration or the issue with something. The next point is checking if you've understood before responding or giving your point. And the benefit of this is, Instead of spending 10 minutes explaining a particular point, which is not something they've actually made, you save yourself time and progress the conversation further by actually talking to the point they actually made, by spending time to clarify before you make your point. And the third tip is, do not always rush into problem solving mode. So if somebody's mentioning a problem with something that, let's say in a meeting or a conversation with a colleague, and they mention a problem about an assignment, instead of assuming that, or instead of immediately running into problem solving mode, just make sure that you're both talking about the same problem and you're not both talking about two different problems or that you have in mind. Meaning on the face of it, the problem may be X, but actually what both your positions are not necessarily to do with X, but Y and Z. So for example, the problem or the topic may be about a deadline, but one is concerned to do with time, the other one's concerned to do with quality. And so if you make sure that you're talking about the same thing, then you're more likely then to progress with what you're talking about. Not because they're necessarily right, but because it's difficult to solve a problem you don't fully understand. And also it's much easier to solve a problem you do understand. Also, when appropriate, try to give yourself more time before responding, because usually, or it can happen, that your first response is not always the best response. Instead, use that time to try to understand fully what the other person is saying. After a difficult conversation, it's easy to say to yourself, did I explain my point well? That's not a bad question, but also making the other person feel heard. While you can't control the outcome of the conversation, you can control, you listened, you understood what the other person had to say. And listening requires patience, it requires self-restraint, and therefore it can be challenging. But the reward of it sometimes is more than what we think. And you don't want the other person walking away from the conversation thinking, yes, they've had a good argument. Rather, you want them to feel like, yes, they feel understood. And remember, people are more likely to listen to what you have to say if they feel understood. Until next time, Assalamu alaikum.